This video is an attempt to piece together in one usable source the Cold War history of Leicestershire, focusing in on the 1980s through to civil defence stand-down in the early 1990s. Particularly the 1980s, as this was the final full decade of the Cold War and thus its most technologically advanced period. Also, the 1980s saw the last war plans drawn up for the county in the guise of the Leicestershire Civil Defence Plan 1986, which is the cornerstone of this video's content. I felt very strongly that it should be written, as it was an important period in the county's history. It was particularly important it was researched now before the memories of those involved have begun to fade, or they have become completely untraceable, or in some cases deceased. The nuclear bunkers have by and large been left to run into disrepair, or the land they once occupied has now been developed. Some of the key emergency planning documents from the period have been destroyed, lost, or earmarked for disposal in the near future. This video therefore tries to preserve all of these elements before they are lost permanently. My inspiration to create this video comes from being shown the film Threads by Barry Hines at school when I was 13 in 1984. Threads is a documentary drama depicting a nuclear attack on the city of Sheffield. It extremely graphically portrays the effects on the city and the battle for survival that inevitably follows. I still rate it as the most frightening film I have watched to this day. Threads was commissioned by the BBC as a replacement to its forerunner, The War Game, which was eventually banned, being deemed too demoralising for the British public to watch. I recently acquired a copy of Threads on DVD just to watch once more and found it as horrific to watch as ever. It will remain permanently in my drawer at home. All of this made me curious about what may have been in Leicestershire. What secret plans existed? Where is my council's bunker? I really forgot about it until I happened upon a website by a group called Subbrit UK. This group catalogue and photograph the UK Cold War nuclear bunkers and defence locations. However, other than the sub-regional HQ bunker at Loughborough, they had no entries for Leicestershire. This immediately re-sparked my interest, and I set out on the long road to producing my own video on the subject. Anyone wishing to further their knowledge of the subject or widen out their interest to a national level should definitely look at what material Subbrit UK have. This video is the result of the best part of a year's research. Hundreds of miles have been driven, countless telephone calls made, and numerous rolls of film used. Hopefully, I have covered most aspects of civil defence planning for the county, but I am ever open to additions, corrections, or recommendations for inclusion. Author Neil Adcock. Locally in Leicester, a city council-backed publication, Leicester and the Bomb, pictured right, was put on sale, showing the effects of a single nuclear bomb falling on the clock tower. It had a sister publication, Leeds and the Bomb. Those for and against having both a nuclear deterrent and civil defence planning fell more or less either side of the political party divide. Labour-controlled authorities Leicester City Council and North West Leicestershire District Council openly opposed both the deterrent and civil defence planning. Indeed, Leicester City Council funded the display of a number of nuclear-free zone signs around the city. By contrast, Hinckley and Bosworth Borough Council, under Conservative control, refused a request to attain nuclear-free zone status. It was no different for the county MPs. Labour politicians, joined by the SDP, opposed Britain's nuclear deterrent, whereas Stephen Dorrell, Conservative MP, fully supported it. The Conservative Party coming to power in 1979 signalled a review of civil defence, or as the Home Secretary called it, a review of civil preparedness for home defence, after more than a decade when virtually nothing had been done. It was around this time that public interest in civil defence saw an upsurge. We saw the publication and general condemnation of the Protect and Survive booklet, and later the screening of the film The War Game. However, the peace movements were also more active, and we saw the growth in the nuclear-free zones (NFZ) movement amongst local authorities, and the revival of CND. 1982 should have seen the running of Exercise Hard Rock, planned to be the biggest civil defense exercise since the 1960s, and involving all the county councils and the regional seats of government, although these would not have been fully manned. Unfortunately, it was a public relations disaster, and about half the councils, mainly NFZ authorities, refused to take part. As a result, in July that year, the Home Secretary announced that he was not satisfied with the state of local authority planning for civil defense, and Hard Rock was postponed. Following the abandonment of Hard Rock, the government put in hand plans to stiffen the statutory regulation of the local authorities, who would be the people who would actually take local control in an emergency. This resulted in the Civil Defence General Local Authority Functions Regulations 1983, issued by the then Home Secretary Leon Britton. The 1983 Act required local authorities to take part in any training exercise organized by the minister. In other words, there would be no repetition of the Hard Rock fiasco. They were also required to establish emergency centers, although in line with the softly approach, these were not to be called war rooms, bunkers, or controls, but the much more acceptable centers. The regulations specifically required county councils to make, keep under review and revise plans to deal with all of the following. 1. Collecting information on the results of hostile attack and distributing such information. 2. Controlling and coordinating action necessarily as a result of hostile attack. 3. Instructing and advising the public on the effects of hostile attack and protective measures to be taken on such effects. 4. Utilizing such buildings, structures, excavations and other features of land in their area as are suitable for use for the purpose of providing civil defense shelters for the public. 5. Providing and maintaining a service in their area for the rescue of persons from damaged buildings and debris in the event of hostile attack. 6. Providing and maintaining a service in their area for the billeting or temporary accommodation therein, and, so far as may be necessary, the maintenance of persons who, owing to hostile attack, are made homeless. 7. Providing and maintaining a service in their area for the prevention of disease, or the spread of disease, in circumstances arising out of hostile attack, including the provision of facilities for emergency sanitation and the removal and disposal of refuse of any kind. 8. Providing facilities for the disposal of human remains in the event of hostile attack. 9. Providing and maintaining a service in their area for the distribution, conservation and control of food in the event of hostile attack, including emergency feeding services and equipment. 10. To clear the roads of debris arising out of hostile attack. 11. Providing and maintaining any other services essential to the life of the community in the event of hostile attack. 12. Secure the participation of voluntary groups and their assistance in civil defense duties. The 1983 regulations were intended to be much more forceful, but some councils remained ideologically opposed and did nothing. Others said they had no money or asked for more information. Even so, it must be realized that all they were required to do was to produce plans on a given range of subjects. There was no requirement for any actual preparations beyond the emergency centers and some staff training. One idea of the new civil defense measures was that civil defense was to be opened up to public scrutiny and no longer be secret. Hence the publication in 1980 of the Protect and Survive booklet. But perhaps the most interesting publication was the Emergency Planning Guidelines for Local Authorities, which was issued in 1985. The content of this large book can be seen from its original title of the Consolidated Circular. It brought together, usually in a modified and toned-down form, all the various emergency services circulars issued by the Home Office covering areas such as the role of the local authority, warning and monitoring, the role of the police, water services, etc. More importantly, it published the plans for regional government after a nuclear strike. As is the case today, emergency planning during the 1980s was a county council function. Between 1973 and 1983, the Leicestershire team was headed up by a Brigadier Paul Davis, who on retirement was replaced by his assistant Colonel Dudley Thornton for some 8 months before his own retirement. Sadly, Brigadier Davis has passed away. However, the following are the recollections of Colonel Thornton on how emergency planning evolved in the county. My background was in planning and strategy for the Army in the Welsh Regiment, which lent itself perfectly to an emergency planning role with Leicestershire County Council. My feeling was on retirement from the armed services that if I took something like a year break doing nothing, that I wouldn't be able to get back into a working mentality again, so I wanted to do something which my skills were appropriate for. Brigadier Paul Davis had taken on the role of Chief Emergency Planning Officer shortly before my own arrival as his assistant. At that time we numbered 4 staff, all with military backgrounds. We worked on 2 specific areas, the war plan and the peace plan. That is not to say we separately apportioned resources or worked separately, but they were 2 distinct documents. I was responsible for producing the peace plan, which dealt with more natural disasters and train crashes, things of that nature. But again, I stress that the 2 areas of planning would overlap, and you could imagine that some areas of peace planning would be useful under war conditions and vice versa. Although I recall a lack of enthusiasm amongst the public for emergency planning issues, the County Council as an authority took it very seriously, which resulted in the growth of the department to 6 staff. The newer members of the team had civilian backgrounds, but as we were senior to them in role and experience, we were able to shape their development. As the growth of the department demonstrated, we got very good backing for our activities from councillors. Of course, it would be difficult in many cases for them to object to our activities on technical grounds, as they lacked the understanding and expertise we had within the team. Therefore, whenever we needed to approach a county council committee for something, it was pretty well always endorsed. This military knowledge really gave us an advantage over many of our counterparts in other counties, as I recall from conversations with them, and we had much better planning arrangements in Leicestershire as a result. Financially, as a team, we didn't have to spend a great deal of money. Things such as seminars were held at council offices, and we were expected to attend them without any extra pay. Also, we didn't have staff driving all over the place, so our costs were comparatively low against other departments. The district authorities in Leicestershire were always supportive and cooperative, and in particular my dealings with the various chief executives. Even those districts with opposing political leanings, Leicester City and North West Leicestershire, fully fulfilled the requirements we placed upon them. Of course, 1979 saw the Conservative Party regain power nationally, but I don't recollect that that had a particularly big impact upon the team, although much stronger civil defense regulation was introduced. Some of the personalities we had to deal with at government level changed, of course, but the government remained as helpful and constructive as they had always been. Turning to war planning, as I stated before, peace and war planning were not rigidly distinct, and thus I was also involved in some of the civil defense seminars we arranged. They were always well attended, and my memory of them is that no one was ever hostile to our plans, and I certainly don't think anyone ever stood up and suggested that what we were doing was a waste of money. There may of course have been some silent opposition, with members of the parish authorities also having members of groups such as C&D, I have no doubt. Personally, if the worst had happened and a build-up of international tension occurred, I would have been required to be at the county council bunker. I was a military man, so of course, as my wife and family have long since accepted, my duty comes first. I would have been there and done what was asked of me. Leicestershire County Council's response to the Civil Defence General Local Authority Functions Regulations 1983 was the Leicestershire Civil Defence Plan 1986. It consists of 3 volumes: Part 1 Background and Policy, Part 2 Local Authority Plans, Part 3 Transition to War Measures. It is on full public record at the County Records Office at Wigston. The County Council employed RAF Group Captain Wally Bainbridge to write the plan, which took him 2 years to complete. The following is an interview conducted with Mr. Bainbridge at his home. Background: I left the RAF in July 1981 and I could have retired, but I still wanted to do something. The Ministry of Defence contacted me and told me that a post was available at Leicestershire County Council for emergency planning, and would I be interested. I said I was, and went for interview and took the job of Senior Emergency Planning Officer, writing the war plan for Leicestershire in the event of nuclear attack. This meant my moving up from London to Leicestershire. Brigadier Paul Davis was the county emergency planner then, until he retired and was replaced by Dudley Thornton. However, Dudley was near to retirement himself, so I replaced him until 1987, when I myself retired. Of course, the Leicestershire emergency team all had military backgrounds. It was considered that they were the best people to have knowledge of the effects of nuclear weapons. Other counties' teams lacked this military expertise, and so I feel that Leicestershire was better for it. Writing the plan. When I began, no plans existed save odd sketchy items and some reference to prominent buildings and such like. The requirement to write a plan was under the 1983 regulations. Basic guidance in very broad terms was issued by the Home Office, but it was left to each county to write their own plans. It did talk of regional government, requirements to have bunkers, radio communications, scientific advices, effects of weapons, etc. It was all focused on nuclear attack. Chemical and biological attack was seen as less of a threat. My plans took no account of where the bombs might drop. It would be difficult to predict that in any case. The job of writing the plan took me some 2 years, and something I did alone. I had no knowledge of Leicestershire before I started, but the principles were the same in all parts of the country. It would be a fair question to ask why, by and large, no plans had existed until that time. The result of all this was the Leicestershire Civil Defence Plan 1986. The first part of the plan gave broad guidance to all of the prime officers of the county and district councils of what to do in the event of nuclear attack. The second part one wrote a year later, in which I gave detailed instructions of each person's responsibilities. I then issued guidance to each parish on what they had to do to comply with the regulations. Each of the emergency services read their own plans in support of my own. We had regular liaison meetings with the emergency services and armed forces, which were well attended. The Leicestershire Plan was an evolving document. It would regularly be amended and added to. There was no way of writing the perfect plan to deal with the effects of nuclear attack. You could only give best instruction to the different authorities. You have to realize I wasn't looking for the perfect document. Goodness knows you only have to take into account what we were preparing for. I simply wrote as best I could what we should do. Committee approval. I had expected opposition within Leicestershire County Council to what I had written. However, I was conscious of the deadline of January 1, 1984. I sent out copies to members a month before that date. A meeting was also held between myself, Sam Jones and the party leaders. It was a large document with a lot to digest, but flicking through it you can get the general idea. There were some rumblings of lack of time to digest, but the deadline was upon us and it was passed unanimously. Home Office. The plan had to be submitted to the F6 branch of the Home Office by January 1, 1984. To be honest, in my own view, most counties continued to ignore this deadline. I myself might have been a week or two late, but I made every effort to meet the deadline set. I thought this was my job done, but I was contacted by F6 saying how good they thought the plan was and could I come and see them and tell them how it was done. So I spent a day discussing this with them. I think really they were looking for someone to do the job of overseeing plans nationally. I had already moved from London, so I wasn't interested. F6 was a small team headed by a female assistant secretary consisting of one-star level military people. They oversaw production of plans, arranged exercises and planned where the government would have gone. Implementation. After the plan was completed, I took over as emergency planning officer, then issued copies of the plans to the relevant bodies. The Leicestershire County Chief Executive at the time, who was Sam Jones, was also the regional convener for the East Midlands counties. I was his number one and held meetings at County Hall for all of the East Midlands County emergency planners on coordinating nuclear war planning. In comparison to other counties, I think we were the only ones to complete our plans on time. I asked for copies from the other counties at regional convening, but was told they were still being written. I set up exercises with the local authorities' scientific advisors who advised on the effects of nuclear weapons. Twice a year planning exercises were held with the involvement of the Royal Observer Corps, usually at weekends. The main local group ROC at Coventry would send fictional messages through, and the scientific advisors would make assessments on what actions to take. However, it was quite half-hearted. The Royal Observer Corps did their stuff, but few other counties were interested. Leicestershire did, however, take civil defence seriously. In terms of dealing with the district authorities, no one was at all antagonistic, but some were slow responding, deliberately so, I have no doubt. This slowness to respond was in particular towards the preparing of wartime HQs. Leicester City's dates from the last war, Charnwood built its own and North West Leicestershire refused to spend money on it. When you consider the effects of a nuclear explosion, who could say that North West Leicestershire were wrong? I had no powers to force local district councils to have a bunker. I did tell North West Leicestershire, for example, their legal obligation, but they refused. I could ultimately have reported them to the Home Office, but we never reached that stage. They weren't alone, however. Rutland didn't really have anything of note. In my role, I visited all of the local authority bunkers around the county and attended meetings at Coventry Group HQ of the Royal Observer Corps. It probably would be fair to say our bunkers were quite limited if you compare them to what the Americans had. But then you can make anything look good if you throw money at it. The point is, what good would it be after nuclear war? The government, rightly in my opinion, said make do with what you have. If you spent money on super bunkers, the public would reasonably ask, what about us? Where is our bunker? Where are we supposed to go if you need such super constructions? Leicestershire County Council couldn't offer financial assistance to districts, but there were grants available from the Home Office. Turning to parish councils, some refused to have truck with civil defence at all. I kept lists of who would and wouldn't participate and simply didn't bother writing to the latter of these. Enforcement measures were available through the Home Office, but forcing participation could easily have worried people. In any case, I don't think the Home Office would have done anything. If war had threatened, parish councils would have started to ask questions and seek guidance. I recall we held public seminars in districts on civil defense planning. CND would often attend and be quite vocal. However, I was quite comfortable that I knew more than them on the subject, and in any case I don't think they put over the points very clearly. It certainly didn't persuade people to get rid of the bombs. I understood the point of view, but I didn't agree with it. It's like saying get rid of the police and there won't be any burglaries. Get rid of the army and the bombs and they wouldn't attack us. The truth is, if they did that, they wouldn't have they'd simply take over. In the end, it was the arms race that overstretched and ultimately brought down the Soviet Union. Wartime conditions. However, I knew the plan had its limitations. When you consider it was dealing with the effects of nuclear attack, there was little it could do. Just look at the effects. No water, no mains, electricity, no gas, and the NHS would have been totally overwhelmed with millions dead, dying and injured. There would have been a total lack of food with no imports. We would have been back to the Stone Age. The country would have been devastated. Let's not get any marvelous idea about how good plans would be. We had no shelters for the public. Normal houses were totally vulnerable to blast and radiation unless you were underground in a cellar which could afford some protection. Otherwise, people would be dying sat in their homes. As for manning of war HQs, there'd be no phones, no communications, shortage of water supplies, and were people supposed to leave their families behind? Could you imagine this? It was quite ridiculous. It would be perfectly understandable for people's reaction to have to go to bunkers. Perfectly understandable they wouldn't want to leave. I expect there would have been, I don't know about panic, but a great deal of concern to get back to their families. I remember asking people amongst the scientific officers would they go, and the answer was no. You put it to me, why not staff them with single people with no family commitments? Well, by and large, people who reach senior positions do have families. You couldn't take a lower-ranking single person and expect them to take a senior role in a war HQ. You couldn't expect lesser qualified people to do it. People would have been unsure of their exact roles. They didn't have time to study war plans and know them inside out. We held seminars and they had a vague idea, but you can't expect them to know everything from seminars. They'd probably have to train at least once a month. They had no time to do that, they had their own jobs. I personally would be expected to go to County Hall. I couldn't opt out of that. I had been in the services and both my wife and I knew what was expected of me. Aside from the personal problems of occupants, there would be countless other problems facing wartime HQs. In the early days after a nuclear exchange, we couldn't risk movement of things like emergency services. It's not like the last war where bombs would drop then clear up the next day and try to carry on as normal. You couldn't do that with radiation. You look at Chernobyl, the people who dealt with that all died in weeks. Not only those on the ground, but those who dealt with it. Sheep as far away as Wales died from the radiation. People trapped by falling buildings, for example, would have to be left, otherwise those trying to rescue them would die as well. With firefighting, for example, fires would have to be left to burn themselves out. Really, in the early days we would have been restricted to plotting explosions and monitoring the spread of fallout. In terms of communications, I don't think you could really protect against the effects of electromagnetic pulse (EMP). Unless you were prepared to spend millions on it, EMP would have meant that communications would have failed. Reflection. I didn't actually think it would ever happen. I think our possession of the nuclear weapons stopped it. However, despite this, I don't think you could stand up in Parliament and say there were no war plans. People would be up in arms. You couldn't leave people with nothing. In terms of resources, what support can you give? Many millions dying, hospitals overwhelmed. How can you justify building shelters when you say having the bomb is supposed to stop war? I remember spending a day working with MAFF. I mean, they probably only had stockpiled a third of the food you would need. Supply of water, of course, would be a major problem. I think even from what I saw on a visit to the water authority, stockpiling would have been quite limited. I think eventually, after several years, Leicestershire would have recovered simply because there would have been a number of survivors. However, life would have been reduced to the absolute medieval level. Farming would take years to recover but would need to be restarted for there to be hopes of survival. Should there have been a central body organizing civil defense instead of local councils, thus free from political interference? I don't think so. I think no matter what political opposition, if there had been a build-up to war, people would have demanded civil defense planning and to forget views like those of CND. I was very aware, however, that what I was doing was at very best very limited and at worst a waste of time and money. It was maybe even counterproductive, making people think something could be done. In some ways it was a political thing to persuade the public something was being done and that plans were necessary. But if that is the case, why don't we have plans today? Shelters are closing and the Royal Observer Corps has packed up. All the main powers still have nuclear weapons. Sure, nuclear war prospects have reduced considerably, but why, if it was so important, then do we not plan still? I was meant to spend 10 years at Leicestershire County Council. I did 6. Sam Jones was disappointed, but I no longer believed in what I was doing. Maybe it was selfish, but they appointed me to write the plan, so I wrote it despite my reservations about it. I didn't have faith in what could be done in the event of nuclear attack. I think civil defense in a county like Leicestershire is pointless. It would be far better to focus on our own nuclear deterrent, which I feel has prevented war. I last read the plan myself before I left the county council and was replaced by Keith Beckwith. I wrote it to the best of my ability, but I have no desire to look at it again, concluded Captain Bainbridge. During the transition to war phase, the UK would have been divided up into 11 home defence regions, which in turn we divided into sub-regions or zones. Full authority to govern internally within each region would have been granted by Parliament under emergency powers in the latter stages of a deteriorating crisis before an attack. As shown on the boundary plan opposite, Leicestershire fell into Home Defence Region number 3. This was further divided into sub-regions 3.1 and 3.2, of which Leicestershire occupied sub-region 3.2. Until 1984. Initially, under post-attack conditions, command would have come from sub-regional headquarters (SRHQs). Zone 3.2 SRHQ was at Burder Street in Loughborough. The primary tasks would be to obtain, process and disseminate information about the extent and effect of attack, to determine priorities and to arrange for the reallocation, where appropriate, of resources to meet immediate needs, to coordinate and support the activities of county controllers. A county controller would be the peacetime chief executive of the county council within the sub-region, and to prepare for the establishment of a regional seat of government (RSG). The number 3 RSG was at Chalfont Drive, Nottingham. Official assumptions were that, given the nationwide disruption of essential services and communications that would result from nuclear attack, regional government could not, in general, be effective for some weeks post-strike. Until such time as regional government could be established, the sub-regional command would be the highest level of internal government. Once regional government was established, the regional commissioner, a junior minister nominated close to the time by the Prime Minister, would have full authority to govern internally. From 1984. In 1984 the government re-examined the Home Defence regional structure. It was decided that it made no sense for SRHQs to carry out all of the initial recovery work only to hand over to a regional body. Thus a regional control would be established from the outset. Therefore, a SRHQ in each region was redesignated as a Regional Government Headquarters (RGHQ), and the other SRHQ to be standby. In Home Defence Region 3, Zone 3.1 control at Skendilby in Lincolnshire was now retitled as RGHQ, and Zone 3.2 control at Loughborough became Regional Standby. The Regional Commissioner and his staff would therefore now locate themselves at Skendilby with a deputy team located at Loughborough. In reality, however, such would be the chaos caused by a nuclear attack. It is most likely that each sub-regional control initially at least would still have full autonomy over their own zone. Regional Commissioners. A regional commissioner's staff would comprise senior officers from government departments, the police, the armed services, and vital sections of commerce and industry. The primary task of regional government would be the production and administration of a strategic plan for the continued survival and eventual restoration of the region to a more normal pattern of life. In time, regional plans would have been modified to come within national policy. Local authorities. Operating below regional government would be the local councils. The plan opposite shows the intended government structure once regional government had been established. Note: a correction to this plan is required. The Chief Constable would be at the sub-regional headquarters, thus substitute for Assistant Chief Constable. Reporting to the Regional Commissioner would be the County Controller, who in turn is reported to by the District Controllers, the peacetime Chief Executives of District Councils within his area. Finally, at community level the Parish Ward Controllers, usually the Parish Council Chairman, report to their respective District Controllers. Here are the recollections of some of the wartime controllers from the period. Sam Jones, a former Chief Executive, Leicestershire County Council. Wartime role, Leicestershire County Controller. There was some resistance to civil defence planning in the mid-80s from e.g. Leicester City Council and North West Leicestershire District Council. This did not, however, prevent full planning taking place, and it was adequately financed. Throughout my time in Leicestershire, I also acted throughout as regional convener, which involved the other four East Midlands counties: Derbyshire, Nottinghamshire, Northamptonshire and Lincolnshire. Again, there was no major opposition to our work. I did attend training at Easingwold, the Civil Defence Training College, a couple of times, and I was in regular contact with the government's regional director at Nottingham, the wartime regional commissioner. Command chain diagram. Preparations could have been more intensive and more regular, but I was aware of the requirements of my wartime role. If the crunch had come, I am not absolutely sure if I would have abandoned my wife and family to take up my position in the bunker at County Hall. I was in fact pretty confident that a major war scenario would not arise. The war plans had been prepared by experienced professionals, namely Group Captain Wally Bainbridge, of course, drawing on available best practice. It was backed up by individual instruction sheets. With hindsight and with my experience of the 2-hour bombing atrocities in the City of London, I fear the plan would have had inadequacies and shortcomings. Such a plan is dynamic and needs to be tested and amended on a regular basis. The resources and commitment required from all concerned was just not available. There were only a few ardent supporters for testing the plan. Basically, civil defense in the 80s was low on priority lists. We met minimum requirements, and people like Wally Bainbridge engendered some enthusiasm and support for the process. John White, a former Chief Executive, Northwest Leicestershire District Council. Wartime role, Northwest Leicestershire District Controller. Note: this authority was against civil defence. I attended 2 courses at Easingwold, one as Information Officer when I was Secretary to the District Council, and one as Controller when I became Chief Executive. The County Council also held the odd exercise and I attended the quarterly liaison meetings. So yes, I was aware of my wartime role. The Council Control Centre was only a couple of officers at the council offices and would not have been of any practical use in wartime. I regarded the council offices as a whole as the peacetime HQ and saw my position as being able to mount an effective response to peacetime emergencies. We were on standby during the Kegworth air crash, for example, though in practice we were not required. I do not know what my response would have been in wartime. There would have been an obvious conflict of loyalties between looking after my wife and family and my public duty. On a more general note, the emergency services appeared to be extremely reluctant to involve the District Council in any civil emergency and may not even have been aware that we had a role. There were several occasions when we should have been involved in providing temporary accommodation, etc. But the emergency services did it themselves on an ad hoc basis. This was frustrating. John Burton, a former Chief Executive, Oadby and Wigston Borough Council. Wartime role, Oadby and Wigston District Controller. All of the district controllers in Leicestershire and Rutland met on an annual basis to keep plans up to date. I did attend the Civil Defence College at Easingwold, and the council did deconvert the basement at the council offices into a district control with all the necessary equipment. On the question as to whether I would have left my family to take up my duties in the bunkers, all I can say is that I am glad I was never put into the situation where I had to make that choice. The council did go along with all the actions necessarily to comply with the regulations, but there was no enthusiasm for the expenditure. There were very few votes in emergency planning. Frank Berry, a former Chief Executive, Harborough District Council. Wartime role, Harborough District Controller. As District Controller Designate, I received training at the Home Office Defence College, Easingwold, on 3 occasions, supplemented by courses, meetings and conferences arranged by Leicestershire County Council. As you know, the District Council's civil defence role was subordinate to the County Council, which had the prime responsibilities. Harborough District fulfilled all its obligations as far as I recollect and cooperated with the County Council in providing local input for the 1986 plan. The District Council was entirely supportive of emergency planning, and many councillors were happy to extend the knowledge by attending Home Defence College courses. The District Council's net spending was comparatively small, as there was considerable reimbursement by the Home Office via County Hall. As an ex-serviceman, I have no reason to feel that I would have done other than meet my civil defence commitments in a wartime situation.